During the 1500s, there were a few Jewish communities who, originating in Italy and now in the Ottoman Empire, and trying to be a part of the Renaissance movement, had embraced elements of immodest dancing. They sought justification in the ancient custom of vineyard dancing that occurred on the 15th of Av and on Yom Kippur in the land of Israel. Examining how the rabbis of the time, during the 16th century, expressed their disapproval will lead us into a discussion about various interpretations of this ancient vineyard dance and how rabbis through the ages had to grapple with this extraordinary ritual.
There's a city in modern-day Greece that is called Arta. And in Arta, in the 1449, was conquered by the Ottomans. And from then on, for a good few centuries, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. During this period, one of the Rabbanim who lived in Arta, his name was Reb Binyamin ben Matisya. And he is the author of the Shalos Tshuvis Binyamin Ze'ev. And he tells the following story. The story, we don't have an exact date of when this happens, but at some time during the lifetime of Reb Binyamin, Reb Binyamin's dates are roughly from 1475 to 1545, so give or take, it's happened sometime in the early 16th century. Let's read the story. Be'ir Arta, in the city of Arta, Nisyashu Dalid Kihilois, you had 4 communities that emigrated from elsewhere and immigrated into Arta. Shabo Migirush Malchus Svardo, Portugal. They came from the expulsion of Spain and Portugal. This is going to help us date when this happened. The expulsion of Spain was in 1492. The Jews were forcibly converted in Portugal in 1497. But then he goes on to say that there were more communities that came into Arta: Sicily, Calabria, and Apulia. These are 3 regions in southern Italy. All of them fell in the late 1400s or early 1500s under Spanish rule. So Sicily from 1479 was under Spanish rule, Calabria from 1501, and Apulia from 1510. The bottom line is that as each of these regions became part of the Spanish Empire, the Jews were expelled from there. Where did they go? They went to the Ottoman Empire, which included at the time the city of Arta. That is our discussion tonight. However, there's also the locals. You had the people who were there from day one, the Jews who were there for living for many centuries. There was a problem, not with the local community, but the emigres that came to town. There was a problem that arose. What happened? There were 3 women who were arusais, and it turned out that they were pregnant. They did not have a chuppah. They did not have the Sheva brachas that we recite under the chuppah. And they had not gone to the mikveh. Notice he does not say uvaloi kiddushin. Kiddushin did happen. There was once a time that Kiddushin and Nisuin were 2 separate ceremonies. The Kiddushin consisting of giving the chassan, giving the kala the ring in front of 2 witnesses and saying, Hareyat mikudeshes li. That was one ceremony. And then a separate ceremony standing under the chuppah, doing the Sheva brachas, and the ksuba, and that's part of Nisuin. Now what happens is that the Tur, writing sometime in the 1300s, says, now we all do it together, which is what we do today. So the Beis Yosef, writing in the 1500s, says, oh, not so quick, you jumped the gun. In Spain, in the 1300s, you're doing it together. But today, even in the 1500s, there are still communities that are doing it separately. What are we seeing here? We're seeing over here that you had in these Italian communities that were coming from southern Italy, that indeed they were doing it separately. So when they emigrated and they came to Arta, they kept that minhag of doing it separately, and this was the problem. The problem was that they had the Kiddushin. They were going to come back in a year to do the Nisuin. In between, there were 3 cases where a pregnancy resulted. The local government, the secular authorities found out about it, and this is a no-no in their eyes. They don't like the idea of children being born out of wedlock, even though Kiddushin happened. From their perspective, this isn't a marriage yet. And so some of them are prosecuted, and the non-Jews prosecuted some of these culprits. This is one problem that resulted from the new immigrants. There was a second problem that was testified in front of the Rabbanim of Arta. There was some those who were acting improperly. They were engaged in mixed dancing. And when they were engaged in mixed dancing, there were those who even touched married women. In other words, you could imagine there were some people who, in their mind, they decided they were okay with mixed dancing if it was singles, people who were married. But then what happened here is that it crossed the line. Even for them, this was too much. It turned into a big outcry. How could you have an individual man dancing with a married woman? Now, before we continue with this tshuva, it's worth pointing out the climate and the time when this tshuva is written. As I said, it's after, obviously, 1510, when the Jews from Apulia had to leave, and this rabbi passed away by 1545, so we can be mitzamtzim, we can narrow it down into those years. Well, what's interesting is that if you look at halachas svarim and tshuva svarim from throughout the generations, you'll find there, here and there, a reference to tznius issues or the problems of, or rabbis warning against the problem of tznius during dancing. But what we find in this time and region, we find a few references that come all of a sudden at once, and that's definitely different from anything prior. So we have this case over here from Arta in the 1500s. At the same time, there was a Rav living at this same time whose name was Rav Mahar Shtam, Rav Shmuel de Medina, and he writes about a case in Portas where there was similar issues. And there was a Rav a little earlier, Rabbi Yehuda Mintz, who was living in Padua, and he was dealing with another issue that we have that's very similar at that time. So that's at least 3 cases within the span of a few decades where we're dealing with the same issue. Whereas if you look back for hundreds of years before, you'll find 1 or 2 pieces here and there, but not so much coming at once. And there's a reason for that. This is here the autobiography of a 17th century rabbi. His name was Yehuda Aryeh of Medina. He's most famous in the Torah world for, if you learn Ein Yaakov, you'll sometimes see pirushim on the side that come from Haboine. If it says that it comes from Pirush Haboine, that's him. A very interesting character. And I don't want to talk too much about him. What I do want to say is when you read his autobiography, you see how significant of a role dancing plays. He's a young child in the 1580s. He passes away, I think, in the 1640s or something like that. And he writes, when he's describing his education in the 1580s, he says, so I was taught music, song, and dance. Okay? When he describes his brother-in-law, and he's trying to describe his milas, he says he knew how to dance. When he talks about his son-in-law, he says that for a living, he would teach dancing. Okay? So this is all over the pages of this no, nothing to do with mixes, just dancing. Why? We're talking about Renaissance Italy. Renaissance Italy is the idea of renewing many of the art forms that have been forgotten and that in ancient Greece used to be practiced. And one of those things was dancing. This was not necessarily wild and almost always specifically not wild, shikar, partying type of dance. It was much more in an art form. And just like knowing languages, people could understand, like that's a good thing, right? So you see many people, even people, knowledgeable people, some Talmid Chachamim as well, this was like a cultural thing that was in the air at the time. And we see it spilling over into the Jewish community. It's no surprise that we see a number of these issues popping up at this time, whereas in earlier generations, we didn't see so much of this, at least as far as the record shows us. Okay, so let's continue with the story. So unnamed people came to the rabbis of Arta and said the whole story. You see, the new immigrants, they're causing these problems. And when the rabbis of the city saw this, they called over the leaders of each of these communities. So each one of these communities, when they came into Arta, they came with their structures, right? The president didn't give up being the president of the community, and the vice president didn't give up. He's still the vice president, just in exile with his community. So they're all called in. And the Rabbanim tell them, the Chomer Isser, how serious of a prohibition we're talking about, both about the fact that there was the cases of the Chassan and Kala living together before the Nisuyin, as well as the second problem notified before. And they said that they are going to lay down the law. And basically they're passing legislation that no Arus, meaning this man who did Kiddushin with his wife, or wife-to-be, however you want to define that period, no Arus is allowed to enter the house of his Arusa from the time that they did the Birchas Eirisin, which he says he links with Suda Shabbos. So it would seem to me that maybe there was a Shabbos after that, especially if the Eirisin happened on Friday, and then the Shabbos after was a celebration. Okay, and then that's it. You do not go back to the home of the Arusa until the time of the Chuppah. Okay, so that's it. They're putting a severe limit on this because of the behavior. And a complete ban on any male and female dancing. This is what they do. And so they convene they bring in the three Rabbanim of Arta, bring in all of the leaders of the community, including the region of Apulia. And the reason we're saying including the region of Apulia, we're going to see they're going to make some trouble in a second. And they explained to them what they're doing. They took a Sefer Torah out, they placed it on the stage, ala duchan, and they issued a cherem, b'knas nidui, cherem, and shamta, al kol mi sheyaver b'takanosam. Anyone who violates these rules is going to be excommunicated. This has spiritual ramifications, this has social ramifications, this has economic ramifications when a person is placed in nidui, cherem, and shanta at this point in time. And while they were in the middle of this ceremony, the leaders of the Apulia community said they're not interested. They're not interested in these enactments. Minig avaysam beyadam. They are following tradition. They have a minig that the Arus does go over to the Arusa's house. Obviously, it was just to hang out in the living room. But this is the minig that they do want to preserve. Lechel v'lishtais yachad, to continue eating. Now, we don't have words here what they said about the dancing. I don't know. It's not here. But we know they also weren't happy about that. But that's not part of their protest right here. And therefore they said they're against this cherem, and they walked out of the shul during the ceremony, bezaika gadola, with a major protest. Okay, but meanwhile, all of the other leaders of the communities accepted Aleyam Va'al Zaram to keep these takanas of the Chachamim. And in fact, even the Apulia Jews who left with the demonstration at the end of the day, de facto, they observed the takana. And this went on for a period of 4 years. Okay, so what's the problem? Everyone's observing it, so Shema Yisrael. However, now, 4 years later, the community of Apulia, they say they want to back out. Although they have been keeping it for the last few years, they never really agreed to it. And so they want to say, we never agreed to these laws, so they're not binding on us. And even though they kept it, that's only because at the time it was one community. The secular authorities only recognized one Jewish community in Arta. They were part of it. So did they have a choice? They could walk out, they could scream and yell. At the end of the day, there was one community. And so therefore, they were kind of forced into it. But now that it seems that they got permission, it's not specified in the tshuva, but this would be my best guess, that they had the ability to become their own incorporated community, recognized by the secular authorities. And so now they're making their own rules. They're making their own rules. They want to throw out their observance of these things. And so now the question is, they're not asking the question, but the other communities want to ask the question, do they have a right to really back out, or are they obligated to keep these rules that were legislated by the community? This question and this tshuva really begins two conversations. One is on a conversation about tznius and the rules of tznius and the values of tznius and one of them. There's a whole nother subject that you really have here, and this actually gets more attention during this period in time in the responsive literature, in the tshuvas, and that is communal structure questions. And you have all these types of questions. If I'm part of a community, but then I move out, are the chumras of that community, the unique takanas that they made, are they binding on me? And what if new Jews enter the community? Are they binding on them? You have a lot has been written on that subject, because these were real issues, especially during the 16th century, when Jewish immigration is happening. A lot of tension comes up in many different communities. And we did in a previous class nusach questions and minhagim questions that came up during this period in time, precisely with these types of Jews. And that's really the other conversation that's happening here in this question. Now, I mentioned before that the climate that leads to this type of question is the Italian Renaissance. But the truth is, we shouldn't assume that this was only happening there. The Italian Renaissance had an influence on all of Europe, and we're able to see that during this same period in time, there's Rabbanim in Central and Eastern Europe who are also starting to grapple with this issue in a way that, again, is incomparable to anything that existed in previous generations. So we turn now to the Maharshal, the Yamshel Shloime, Reb Shloime Luria. He was the Rav in Lublin during the 1500s, and he writes as follows in the Seches Gittin: "Ume'ata libi boyer ketanor al am Hashem." My heart is aflame, like a furnace, about the Jewish people. Shem shoisim b'minei zemer, that they're involved in certain drink parties. V'kama aveinos biyadam, which leads to a number of transgressions. First and foremost, mi hiter lehem liyos b'machol echad im hapsulos, who permitted them to have this mixed dancing. This is not the precedent that we were taught by our ancestors. And he's not the only one. You had in Belz at the time a Rav, a little later. His name was Rabbi Avram Chaim Shor. He passed away around 1630. He deals with this issue in his commentary on Maseches Avodah Zarah, talking about it as a contemporary issue. The Shalah, who passed away in 1630, was a Rav in Central Europe. Later he moved to Eretz Yisrael. He writes about this issue as a contemporary issue. We're able to see that what may have began in Italy really spreads to other areas in Europe, and this becomes the Nisayan, a big Nisayan that's happening in that generation. Okay, well, in the many pages of writing that exist on this subject, the 15th of Av, Chamisha Asar B'Av, surfaces. Because one of the things that we're going to see about Chamisha Asar B'Av is the idea of the women dancing in the field and men being in proximity to them. And so this was cited, and the Rabbanim, as we're going to see, had to deal with that. But let's take a step back and first learn a little bit about Chamisha Asar B'Av and then lead into that specific subject. So the Mishnah in Tainis in Perek Daled, Mishnah Ches, says as follows: Lo yahayu yomim tovim liYisrael kachamisha asar ba'av u'chayam kippurim. There were no holidays that were as great as Chamisha Asar B'Av and Yom Kippurim. Frek the Gemara. So the Gemara asks, Bishlama Yom Kippurim. If you want to tell me Yom Kippur, I understand why it was such a great Yom Tiv. Number one, the Isbei Slicho Mechila. This is the day that God forgives the Jewish people. Number two, related to number one, Yom Shenitnu by Luchas Achronos. Moshe Rabbeinu came down on Yom Kippur according to our calculations. It was Yom Kippur when he came down with the second people and said the Eibishter was Meichel you and gave them the second Luchas. So we understand why it's such a great Yom Tiv. Elachamisha Asar Ba'av Mahi. What is special about the 15th day of Av? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, and here we have the Gemara, the Amoraim in the Gemara that are going to suggest, because the Mishnah did not say anything, so we have no information of the Tanoim about what happened on this day. The Amoraim are going to give 5, 6, 7 different biurim explanations what happened. Of course, all of them could have happened, and there's different ways of understanding what was the primary issue that led to the Yom Tiv. So first up, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Yom Shehutru Shvatim Lavai Zeh Bazeh. You have in the Torah where Moshe Rabbeinu says after the Maisa of Bnei Tzlafchad that women who are estate bearers, meaning they own property, they have to stay married within their own shevet. Why? Because if they have an estate and they're going to marry a man from another shevet, that property now gets moved from shevet Reuven into shevet Shimon, and that's not fair for shevet Reuven. If the women do not have any ownership in any estate, then this limitation didn't apply to them. But nonetheless, this was, I guess, a little bit of an issue. All of a sudden, certain women could only marry within their tribe. That's a limitation. Marriage could be difficult itself to make another obstacle wasn't desirable. And what happened was that at a certain point, Chachamim made a gzera. It's not entirely clear when this was made. When Chachamim made a drasha, it's not entirely clear when this drasha was made, but a drasha was made, a diuk in the pasuk, that it was only that generation that went into Eretz Yisrael that had this limitation, but this limitation didn't apply in later generations. And the day that this discovery, this analysis of the text was made, that this drasha was passed by the Sanhedrin, so to speak, would have been on Chamisha Asar B'Av. That is the first explanation. Then comes Rav Yosef in the name of Rav Nachman and says there's a different issue, also about marriage, but a different issue. And that is, Yoim Shehuter Shevet Binyamin Lavai Bakal. This is the story of when Shevet Binyamin was allowed to re-enter the Jewish people. So this is going to become relevant in a minute, so I'll take a minute to give the background of the story. At the end of Sefer Shoftim, you have one of the most troubling stories in all of Tanakh, where there is a man traveling, and he is in the area of Shevet Binyamin, in a place called Giva, and he's there with his Pilegash. Pilegash is a wife, but not a full wife. She didn't have all the rights that a regular wife would have. And night is coming, and he's waiting to be invited into someone's home. He's in the area of Shevet Binyamin. No one's inviting him. Finally, someone does invite him into the home. A few hours later, there's a knock on the door, and this may sound familiar to you from the Stoim story, and indeed, there are many parallels between this story and the Stoim story. And they say, send out your guest that came because we want to do the worst to him. And instead, what happens is this man pushes out his Pilegash to them, and she is raped multiple times during the night. And she dies on the step of the home. The man opens the door in the morning and sees what happened. It says that he took his Pilegash, he dissected her body. Whether it's permitted or not is another story, but this is what he did. There's a lot of questions when you learn this story. He dissected her body, sent one piece to each Shevet in order to instigate them, to get them upset and raged about what happened. And indeed, the Shvatim all gathered together and decided that they went to Binyamin and they said, hand over, like they asked for extradition essentially, hand over the culprits. Binyamin said, we got this, we're going to take care of this ourselves. Sometimes happens, right, in the modern world where one country goes to another and says, hey, something internal, and the internal country says, no, you can leave us alone. And so you have that tension over here. In fact, there's a machlokes between Ramban and Abarbanel about whether Bnei Yisrael had the right to make this demand of Shevet Binyamin, but that's not our story now anyway. But Poel, Binyamin said no. Am Yisrael went to war against them. They lost the first battle, they lost the second battle, but in the third battle they won, and many in Shevet Binyamin were killed. And what happened was there's very, very few survivors, and now the issue is, okay, how, and during this time they also said that Shevet Binyamin is not allowed to marry into Am Yisrael. And this was basically cutting off. It's a complete cutting off of Shevet Binyamin. The story then continues that they then realized there was a few survivors of Shevet Binyamin, and then they had charata. You know what? We don't want Shevet Binyamin to disappear. We want it to survive. And so what did they do? So first they went to a city that didn't come to war, and because they didn't come to war, they warned, if you're not going to come join our war, you're going to be punished. So there was one city that didn't come to the war, so they went there, they killed everyone, and then they took the women, and so now you had women who were available for the men of Binyamin to marry. So that was one thing that they did, but at the end of the day, there were still a number of men of Binyamin who did not have wives, and they wanted to, it's an endangered species. So what they did is they told them, look, we made a shvua that we're not going to give our daughters to you, but you can go and take our daughters. And so there's going to be a certain chag. It doesn't say what the chag was, what day of the year it was, but there's going to be a certain chag in Shiloh, and the girls are going to be out dancing in the vineyards. You go out and you could take whoever you want. And they did that. And that was kind of the second step. But still, you still have the issue. What's going to be the next generation? How are you going to, what's the long-term solution? And this is where the third step in this process happened, is where they made a drasha that the shvua that they had made, that we are not going to give our children to Shevet Binyamin, it was only binding on them, was not binding on future generations. And the day that they made this discovery that this was the true meaning of the shvua, and that it was mutter for them, therefore the next generation, to give their children to the men, their daughters to the men of Shevet Binyamin, that happened again on Chamisha Asar B'Av. That's the meaning over here when we say Yom Shehutru Shvatim Lavoi Zeh B'Zeh. Number 3, Yom Shehuter Shevet Binyamin Lavai Bekal. Then Rabbi Bar Chana says, this is the day that the Meisei Midbar passed away. The Meisei Midbar stopped passing away. What's the meaning of this? The meaning of this is that every year the people who are between 20 and 40 who had to pass away in the Midbar during the 40 years, 20 and 60 in the Midbar, they would pass away on Tisha B'Av. And one year, they all went into their future graves on Tisha B'Av, and none of them passed away. They thought maybe they made a mistake with the calculation. They went back on Yud, Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel. Finally, when it came to Vav, they realized the moon is full. It means that they didn't make a mistake in the calculation. It's Taka not Tes Ba'av. It's Taka Chamisha Asar Ba'av. And it must mean that there's no more deaths that are going to be happening this year. The Gemara then continues and says, and why is that a good thing? This is the way Rashi learns the Gemara. And so why is that a good thing? At the end of the day, it's people dying. So people who needed to die stopped dying. So nothing spectacular happened. So the Gemara continues and says, the reason that's a good thing is because actually kalu Meisei Midbar lo haya dibur im Moshe. As long as the Meisei Midbar didn't finish passing away, the Eibishter wasn't in communication with Moshe, which Rashi says, of course he was in communication with him, because we have to say that because of other things, but beyichud v'chiba, that intimate type of conversation that the Eibishter would have with Moshe Rabbeinu was suspended for all of those years, and that's why this is a big Yom Tov. There are others who learned that no, the very fact that Meisei Midbar stopped dying in and of itself was a Yom Tov, because there were some people who really were supposed to die, and that judgment was suspended, and that would render it a Yom Tov as well. Ula then says, the next thing is that there was a king named Hoshea ben Elah, and Hoshea ben Elah took away the roadblocks separating the Jews in the north from going down to Yerushalayim. The Kitzur, what happened here is as follows. There was a king, Yeravam ben Nevat, who breaks away, together with the 10 Shvatim, away from Rechavam, the son of Shlomo HaMelech. And what you have is two kingdoms. You have in the south Yehuda and Binyamin, and you have in the north the other Shvatim led by Yeravam ben Nevat. Now, where's the Beis HaMikdash? In Yerushalayim. That's in Chelek Yehuda. Who presides over the Beis HaMikdash? The king of Yehuda. So that's not good for you. Yeah. But that's not good for you. You don't want your people going to their territory. So what do you want? You want to build your own Beis HaMikdash. So you did. Yeravam ben Nevat put up big shrines, set up shrines, but that's not enough. You have to stop people from going down, which is what he did. Hoshea ben Elah later was a king in later generations. He took this roadblock down, and suddenly now Jews are able to go from the north, are able to visit Yerushalayim.
Is that the Egel by Don?
Yeravam ben Nevat put up these shrines. Hoshea ben Elah didn't take down the shrines. What he did was he took away the guard post. Rav Masna says this is the day that Harugei Beitar were allowed to be killed. Bekitzer, you had the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s of the Common Era. The last stand of the Bar Kokhba revolt was in Beitar. And when the people in Beitar were killed, for many months they were not allowed to be buried. And finally, the day that permission was given for them to be buried was on Chamisha Asar Ba'av. And then finally, the last one is Rabbah and Rav Yosef say this was the last day that they used to cut wood for the Maracha, for the Mizbeach. Why is that a simcha? So first of all, what is this? So as you move away from Chamisha Asar Ba'av you start marching toward the fall, so the moisture in the wood makes it prone to have worms, and you don't want that on your Mizbeach, you don't want that in the Beis HaMikdash. So the last day that they would harvest wood would be on Chamisha Asar Ba'av. Why is that a simcha? Siyum Shal Mitzvah. This is one of the early Mekaydos we have for the idea when you finish a mitzvah, for example, Hilchas Brachas and Rambam, it's a simcha, or in fact, Simchas Torah. This is because just like here, the finishing of the Eitzim was a simcha, so too the finishing, because when you finish a mitzvah, including the mitzvah of Limud HaTorah. Now, after reading all of these, of course, there's so much to say about each of this, and one major question that remains is, okay, I get why it's a Yom Tov, but why is this a greater Yom Tov than all the other Yom Tovim? That's a question that I don't know that this text on the face of it actually resolves. Much has been written on that, but that's not going to be our subject for today. Okay, now that we know that it's a Yom Tov, how was this Yom Tov observed? What were the rituals of this Yom Tov? So for that we go back to the Mishnah in Tainis, Perek Dalid, Mishnah Ches. Zok the Helike Mishnah, Shebehem, Benois Yerushalayim, the girls of Yerushalayim, Yoitzois v'choilois bakramim. They would go out and they would dance in the vineyards. And what did they say? Bachor, young man. So in Tanakh, Bachor means chosen. It's Malosha Nivchar. But we use that term to refer to a young man. Why is that? So the Radak has a sefer called Sefer HaShoroshim. In Sefer HaShoroshim, in the Erech, in entry Beis Ches Reish, he first defines the word Bechira, being chosen. And then he says a young man is called Bachor because from a community's perspective, he's the most chosen, he's the best for Malacha and Molchama. So in other words, from an economic perspective and a geopolitical perspective, who's your best guy? You want the guy who's 18 years old. He's the one that brings you, if you're the mayor of town, he's the one who brings you the best bang for your buck. The guys who are 20, 30, 40, 50, a little less so. So that's in terms of the meaning of the word Bachor. This is what the Radak says. But very often in Tanakh, it not only means someone young, it also means someone unmarried. And that's why you'll see it parallel with Besula. Besula always means a woman who's unmarried. So Bachurim v'gam Besula is the parallel. Okay, so they turning to a Bachor. In other words, there's an unmarried man who's standing there and could hear her speak. And she says, Son no'inecha, lift up your eyes, and look, ma'ata berla, look at what you're choosing. Al titein einecha benoi, don't look at beauty. Ten einecha b'mishpacha, look at family. The pasuk says, Shakar achein, v'hevel hayofi, grace and beauty is false and vain. Isha yiras Hashem, a God-fearing woman, he sees halal. Now the woman said, Ten einecha b'mishpacha, look at family. The citation is from a pasuk that says, look at yiras Hashem. So the commentaries say, the two are linked. In other words, when someone comes from a good family, the chances are significantly higher that they will indeed be a yiras Hashem. Nothing is guaranteed in life, but there's a bigger chance for that type of thing. So this is the dance. This is the dance that we have in Mishnah and Tainus. We get a little more information in the Braisa that elaborates a little more. Tana Rabbanan zok the Braisa. What did the beautiful women say? Tnu einechem liyofi. Look at the beauty. She'eino isha ela liyofi. For a woman is for nothing but beauty. Miuchasei shabahen ma hayu oimres. What did the one with good pedigree? What did they say? Tnu einechem mishpacha. Look at the family. Lefi she'eino isha ela labanim. Because it's all about producing the future generation of family. And so, looking at where I come from, looking at the past mishpacha will bode well for the future mishpacha as well. The ones who were, it's a hard word to translate as ugly, right? Take your purchase l'shem shamayim. Now on a very superficial level, what you're having over here is that in the Mishnah, you have just one statement, the look at the family, and then the price is saying, oh well, really, that's only one voice. There are actually more voices. We're going to see later at the end that's actually not the only way to learn this. You could learn it another way, and we'll see that other way later. But for now, the simple way is the Mishnah has one voice, and then the price expands it and gives you three separate voices. Okay, now let's see how this source, and it's going to be pretty obvious how, was seemingly being invoked by those who wanted to justify their minhag of the mixed dance. So we'll start with the Maharshal, because we saw before that he was agitated by this issue in his day. So let's read what he has to say. He first quotes from a pasuk in Yirmiyah Perek Lamed Aleph that says as follows. The pasuk says, "Az tismach besula b'machil." The young woman, the unmarried woman, will be happy in her dance. This is talking about a nevuah of what will happen when Mashiach comes. And bachurim uzkeinim yachtav. And then the bachurim and the older people together. So he makes a diuk over here. There's the reisha of the pasuk and there's the seifa. The reisha of the pasuk has the women in their dance. The seifa of the pasuk has the bachurim with the skeinim. The bachurim are with the skeinim. Young men are with old men. The young men are not with the women. That's number one. And he says this is a pasuk that's talking about when Mashiach comes. Even when Mashiach comes, you're going to have that. If so, how much more so today, where the nisyonis and the negative repercussions from this type of behavior are obvious for all of us. Then he quotes the pasuk that we say in davening, bachurim v'gam besulois. It does not say bachurim im besulois. So it shows that there's some distinction between the two, and there needs to be that type of separation. Now he says, oh, you're going to ask a question, me anshe binyamin. What's the question, me anshe binyamin? So let's go back to the story, Pelegesh Begiva, where they went over to the men and Binyamin said, you need wives. Some of you got wives because we did this war and we conquered some women and we provided it for you. But others, you don't have wives. So what you can do is you can go find women in the vineyard. So here it sounds like he's asking. It sounds like it's a question because there are women present and dancing and that men are going there. So he says, hold on. It does not say that the men are part of the dance. All it says is that they should go to the dance in order to identify a woman that they would be suitable for them as a wife. Then he says, what about another text? You have the passage in Tainis that there was a time, and by the way, here I should say, when was this time that B'nai Yerushalayim Yotzais? Like, when did it start and when did it end? There is no information in the Chazal sources about was it during Bayis Rishon, the first half of Bayis Rishon, the time of the Shoftim, after the Shoftim. There's no information about this at all. But anyway, whenever it did happen, they went out on these 2 days on Yom Kippur and on Tesvav B'Av. Here too, don't get carried away and use this as a precedent, because loy nemar shahayu bachurim imahem b'machel. The source does not say that the men were with them in the dance. They went to scout out from far. This is what happened. Okay, now he still realizes that someone would say, okay, so there's not mixed dancing, but still seems inappropriate. Like, what's up with this? So he goes on and he says, this also was for a good purpose. If this woman would be suitable in his eyes, marriage. In other words, this was dating for marriage. Dating for marriage is a special thing. And in fact, we're told by Chazal that you have to see the woman first. Mitzvah l'reisa mekodim. It says in the Gemara in Kedushin Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph that it's forbidden for a man to be mekadosh a woman without seeing her first. And sometimes it's not always easy to, depending on the societal norms. Are you able to see her, not able to see her? Here you had a situation where it was possible and this was access. You were able to see what was going on and you needed to. And so this is why it was justified. It was number one, it was for marriage. And number two, before marriage you need to have some degree of observation. This is what it was going to be. But what's going on here in Poland in the 1500s, says the Marshal, this isn't for any other purpose just than the indulgence of pleasure, which is incorrect. Now, going back to the story in Arta, what happened was that the Rabbanim, they made their cherem, which we read about and we learned about before. In addition, they tried getting support, and they did get support from many of the local Rabbanim and Batei Din in the area, including Reb Binyamin ben Matisya himself. He was not part of the Rabbanim of Arta. He lived there, but he was not an official member of the Beis Din. And he wrote a long tshuva justifying what the Beis Din had done. And likewise, others during this time did so. And one of them was the Beis Din in Constantinople. This is the capital of the Ottoman Empire at the time. There were 5 Rabbanim that signed a letter coming out of Constantinople supporting the move. And they do something very similar to what the Marshal was doing. They're writing a little before. In fact, there's so much parallel between these passages, it's very possible that Marshal even saw this because it was printed early on. In the Binyamin's Av is where it was published. So let's see what the rabbis of Constantinople had to say. Arta is in Greece. Arta is in Greece. But remember, 1449, it's conquered by the Ottomans, as many different areas in Greece are, and it's part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so they say as follows. Yes, it is true that we find in biblical references to the idea of women dancing. We see Miriam Hanaviah dancing. We see that when David came back from his wars with the Plishtim, there were women dancing. However, if you look at the text in all these cases, you will see that it's the women dancing on their own. There is no reference to men being part of these dances. What about the story of the Bnei Binyamin? Same thing. That story of the Bnei Binyamin. Women are dancing, men are going there, but they're not part of the dance. What about the Soif Meseches Tainius, where we talk about 15th of Av and Yom Kippur? Same thing. Lirois ulistakel, not to join the dance. And they quote the saying Gemara in Kedushin Daf Mem Aleph that it's forbidden for a man to be mekadesh a woman without seeing her. And so that is what this is about. Avoli is chulin ha'anoshim im hanoshim. Chulin is machol, a dance of men and women. Chulin hein. Okay, they say that's choil, that's negative. This is improper. This is the story that we had over there. Here we see how the issue of Chamisha Asar Ba'av came up. What was clarified was, number one, it wasn't mixed dancing. Number two, in both of these sources, they explain why this was happening. This was a way for people to find a shidduch and to do so in a way that was compatible in halacha for them to see their spouse. Now, this concludes the first part of the shir. But the truth is that if you think about it, you can still ask the basic question. That is, it still sounds like this is not the way I would imagine the ideal way of setting up a system for dating and shidduchim is. And remove the mixed dancing question, and we have. And we even understand that there's some value, because for shidduch purposes here, but it still sounds a little problematic, I would say, to have this type of ritual. And so what I want to look at is some of the Rishonim now who were bothered by this and how they grappled with it, how they dealt with that. And I think we'll be able to learn from the things that they said on this subject. So first up now is Reb David ben Reb Levi of Narbona. Not so very famous because his Sfarim weren't published for a very long time. He wrote a sefer called on the Gemara, on the Rif, on the Gemara, Sefer HaMichtam. And it's a commentary on a number of Meseches. On Meseches Tainis, it was published for the first time in Tavshin Chav Gimel in 1963. That was the first time it was published from one manuscript. There's only one manuscript left in the world of this man's commentary. He lived in the mid 1200s in Provence, in Narbonne, in southern France. And so that's how we have the schus of having his pirush. We're able to see what he says. We're going to read what he says. I just want you to know that it's more famous this was quoted in others from the Orchos Chaim and the Kolboy from around the same period in time and region. They quoted their Sfarim, were printed and were well known, and so most people knew the passage from them, but it's pretty clear that the original source of this discussion is in Reb David ben Reb Levi of Narbonne. So he says as follows: Yesh tmeyin al zeh minig. There are people who have the question about this minig. How is it possible? How is it that the rabbis thought it's a good idea to just go and grab a wife? So what's bothering him? It just seems lawless. That's what it looks like. People are going and they're taking women. It's ripe for abuse. And this is what's on his mind. In other words, he's concerned about men just going, there's women there, who's there to protect them? Who is their agents? Who is their advocates? And how do you know men aren't taking advantage of them? How do you know that the woman is marrying someone who's actually good for her? And this is what he's concerned about. So let's see how he addresses this. He says, this is not an issue. Number one, you need to know that anyone who had parnasa, if you had parnasa and you'd be able to marry off a child, no problem, you didn't go there. So that's number one. So in other words, I don't know how you want to do this. Let's, for argument's sake, let's say Am Yisrael is 50-50. 50 had parnasa and 50 were impoverished. 50% of Am Yisrael is b'chlal not going there. We'll soon see why. So in other words, if you were dealing with a problem, now the problem is half as big because there's fewer people. Then he goes further and he says, and if you're from the 50% that is going there, hold on a second. So let's think about this. If the girl is under 12 and a half, a katana is up to 12, and then the 6 months between 12 and 12 and a half is the din of a naira. During that period of time, a man cannot be mekadesh a woman. A man can give her a ring and say, and she could say, yippee-doo, I accept it. It's like he was mekadesh a tree. Nothing happened. Why? Because kiddushin can only happen through the father up to 12 and a half. So if you're going to send a young girl and it turns out it's not a good shidduch, there's no aguna question or no, the man disappears, no issue, because if you don't like the shidduch, the father don't like the shidduch, there is no shidduch that is going to happen. So therefore, that solves a big part of the problem. What about if the girl's 12 and a half and up? So now how does this make sense for her? So he says, item number 3, don't send her. If you're not comfortable or if you think it's not good for her, don't send her. So that's his third point. And what about if you are going to send her, but you're still a little concerned? You tell her and you warn her. A woman could only be mikudeshes ladaita. A woman cannot become mikudeshes against her will. So you tell her, say no unless you know, if it's the neighbor who you anyway were thinking, okay, then you could, that you could say yes to. Don't do anything that's reckless. You tell her. And she's already older, she's a shtickle mature, and so it's going to be fine. So that's his fourth point on why he doesn't see it like there's going to be this big ruckus of people being taken advantage of, women being taken advantage of. He doesn't see that. And then he says, okay, but Fard, why do we need this? Why do we need this? So this comes back to what we spoke about before, about if you had money, you didn't go. The problem was economics always played a significant part in marriage, some generations more, some less. And you had, especially in his day, in his perspective, a woman without a dowry had a very hard time getting married. And there are many sources from the period of Rishonim that are saying that. Whether you have such sources on biblical times is another story. I don't want to get into that. But the bottom line is, he's looking at it through that lens, and he's saying, you have women who have a very difficult time getting married. Maybe it's for financial reasons, maybe it's for other reasons. This is their opportunity. This is their opportunity to get exposure, to go out to the field, and maybe something good is going to happen. You're solving the shidduch crisis. Which is why he's saying those who felt confident they're going to have no problem making a shidduch didn't send their girls there. It was those who were like they're up against the wall. And the lashon that he uses over there is, if they're not going to do this, ulai hayu yoshvais ad shetalbin roishon. They're going to sit at home until their hair turns white. He wants to invoke in you a shtickle rachmanis. That's what he wants you as a reader. He wants you to feel bad for them. So if you feel bad for them right now, then he was being successful. That's what he wants you to do. Why? Because he wants you to understand what was the justification for this type of minig. Exposure for these women who need exposure. And then he adds one last point. I'll say this is point number 6. What does he say? Moisef al kol zeh shall yudoyros kshedim v'al yo'osim ma'aseim l'shem shamayim. You're talking about generations where they were proper, and so you didn't have to worry too much of people doing negative things. This is how Reb David ben Reb Levi of Narbona addresses this issue. So to put it into context, do you have an issue with mixed dancing? We established no. What was the function? We said, it's a function of marriage and seeing the bride. Is that the way you need to do this, really? And aren't you concerned of problems? We have the answer. Yes, this was the best way to do it for those who really needed it. And there really isn't any concern in his mind that there would be any abuse over here. Now let's turn to Spain. Around the same time, in the 1200s, 1300s, you had a man by the name of Rabbi Yeshua ibn Shuib. He was a Talmud of the Rashba. And he wrote his drah. He would presumably give drashas in shul. And he wrote down those drashas, and they've been published a long time. They were printed a long time ago. And he has a discussion in Parshas Va'eschanan, which is the week that Tu B'Av, the Chamisha Asar B'Av is. And look, he is also bothered by this, but you'll see, he's bothered by something else. He's not concerned about abuse. He's concerned about modesty. For him, it's a straight up modesty question. So let's see what he has to say. V'yesh bekan makom iyun sheyira tema gdoila. He uses the same tema groisa shayla. Heyach b'nais Yisrael atznuos noyagos k'minig gaza. How could modest Jewish women do this? Definitely in Spain during this period of time, this type of behavior would have been considered extremely immodest. V'aksiv kol kvuda baz melech penima. V'heyach loichashashu liyetzara. How could you not? You're stimulating the yetzara. What is his answer? His answer is the following. It must be that we're dealing here with this was practiced in a generation of such holy people that they were like Adam and Chava lifnei Achet. Where Adam and Chava lifnei Achet, the whole concept of sexuality was the same like any other area of life. There was no selfishness involved. It was completely about doing Ratzon Hashem. And because it was devoid of anything selfish, and so therefore there was no problem doing this activity whatsoever. No one's having hirhurim, no one is having immodest thoughts, no Yetzer Hara is being stimulated, everything is centered around Hashem, and the white clothing, the Mishnah describes that the women would be in white clothing, indicates this. What's white? White always symbolizes purity, and indeed that represents the fact that they were so pure. What's difficult in this explanation is that how do you say that during the time Achar Achet, you had a generation or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, we don't have the information, where you had such extreme Kedusha, without anyone, no one, complete from the top to the bottom, the entire generation, so pure, where there was no selfish element to this area of life. It's a little hard. How many passages in Gemara talk about the fact that it's always there and no one should think that they're beyond it, etc., etc. So I'm not saying that there is, I'm not chas v'shalom contradicting what Rabbi Yeshua ben Shuib is saying. What I'm trying to say, the reason I'm asking this question is I want to highlight the chiddush habedavar of what he's saying is really a big chiddush. So Reb David bar Reb Levi was more concerned about the abuse to women. And why in general are we even doing this? Rabbi Yeshua ben Shuib was concerned about how this is modest, how this is good for men, how this is good for a society. And his answer is, well, in that pristine, very holy state, it's not a problem. Now, the emes is that along the whole way, we were talking about 2 days. We're talking about Chamisha Asar B'Av and Yom Kippur. So all the questions that we asked till now was really, we asked them, you could apply those questions both. Mixed dancing, abuse, why are you doing this? Is it modest? You could ask those questions, you could ask both for Yom Kippur and Chamisha Asar B'Av. But when it comes to Yom Kippur, the emes is, you have a much more serious question. And that is, however you want to explain it, obviously Rabbi Yeshua ibn Shuib would have an answer. If it's so holy, then even Yom Kippur, fine. If you reach a state of you're in Gan Eden, Lifnei Achet, fine, Gan Eden, you can do Yom Kippur. But really, we're doing dating on Yom Kippur? Like, how does this make sense? In fact, there's this wonderful quote from Reb Yaakov Shimshon Shabsi. He's famous for writing the commentary. When you learn Masechah Shabbos, you may remember Shabbos Shalmi. That's his commentary. He lived in the 1800s in Italy. So look what he writes in his Sefer Nazir Shimshon. He writes as follows: Kol yomai nitzta'arti. I always was bothered. How did they choose a most awesome day of the year to incite their Yetzer Hara, and to call out, hey, look at me. How can you say that? And even if you tell me that there was no Aveira because it was Yom Kippur and it's such an awesome day, so people are afraid of Yom Kippur and so therefore nothing negative happened as a result, you're going to tell me there wasn't a problem of immodest thoughts? And he says, till today, and even today, I have not found a resolution to this problem because I've never found an interpretation that sits well on my heart. This is what he said. And in fact, we have some who wanted to deny that this ever happened on Yom Kippur. No less than Reb Hai Goin is quoted in a work from Yemen. This is put together by a man named Reb Avram ben Shloimeh. He lived in the 1400s. Reb Yosef Kapach published his commentary to Tanakh. And in this commentary to Tanakh, he writes, Rav Hai Goin said that this thing of Bnei Yisrael going out is only said on Chamisha Asar B'Av. It did not happen on Yom Kippur. So there, Lo Yom Tovim Yisrael Ki Yom Kippur and Chamisha Asar B'Av. Shabahen, that whole Shabahen of what happened is only going on the second of those 2 days. Only Chamisha Asar B'Av has nothing to do with Yom Kippur. In a different way, the Chidah, writing much later obviously, says the following. When he quotes it, it's very casual what he does. He writes, it says in Maseches Tainis, the Bnei Yisrael would go out on Tes B'Av and Motzei Yom Kippur. Right? He just adds one word, Motzei Yom Kippur, very, very casually. But think about it. It's like, yeah, Motzei Yom Kippur is also a day. It's also special. We speak about it as like as a Yom Tif, as a special time. So that's when it happened. It happened Yom Kippur after the fast. And so therefore it's after Yom HaGadol VaHaKadosh completed. But in another way, he's denying that it happened on Yom Kippur. So one way of denying it is to say, B'chlal Navi Yom Kippur, or you say it happened in Motzei Yom Kippur. Another way of denying, there's another way of denying. And this comes from Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz. Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, who lived in the 1800s in Germany, wrote a commentary called the Tiferes Yisrael HaMishnayis. And what he does, he says, there's no way this happened on Yom Kippur. It's not possible. So therefore, how are we supposed to understand this passage? It's a metaphor. He explains it as a metaphor. Who is the woman? The woman is Am Yisrael. Who's the Bacher? The Bacher is Hashem. In Shir HaShirim, you have the dialogue between the woman and the man. The woman represents Am Yisrael, and the man represents Hashem. And the woman, Jewish people, turn to Hashem and say, lift up your eyes. Take a good look at us. Are you going to find anyone better than us? don't look at beauty. Don't look at beauty. Because you know something? We have sinned. And so we're not so beautiful. But look at the mishpacha. Look at the mishpacha. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And by the way, Shakar Achein Vehevel HaYofi, about the other, you're going to look at the other nations and you're going to say they have certain milas, they do certain mitzvahs. The mitzvahs that they're doing, they don't have the best intentions when they're doing those mitzvahs. So even their Chein and even their Yofi is Sheker and is Hevel. We're Isha Yiras Hashem. We are Isha Yiras Hashem, even though we have flaws, but Hisis Halo. You know why Hisis Halo? Because we did Tshuva on Yom Kippur, and so therefore even the negativity, even our lack of beauty turns into beauty because the Aveira stimulates greater growth. Tshuva turns the Aveiris into Zachias, and so therefore we are the ones who are the ones to be praised. Hi Isha Yiras Hashem, Hi Tis Halo. This is a beautiful explanation that he provides, again in a different way, denying that this dating ritual happened on Yom Kippur. In a Sikha, the Rebbe says, maybe it's a beautiful taich, however, the Lashon of the Rebbe is, Umasha Kasuv, one second, Umasha Kasuv b'Tiferes Yisrael, Shebiyoyim HaKippurim iskavnu rak la'Kadosh Baruch Hu v'lo l'sheduchim. This at Tiferes Yisrael says that it was all about a conversation with God and nothing to do with Shidduchim. Ein emasim lepashtos Lashon HaMishnah, this is inconsistent with the basic language that you have in the Mishnah, Rashi, the Ran, and the Rif. And therefore, in this Sikha, the Rebbe goes on to offer an alternative explanation for how this could work on Yom Kippur, which will also give a nice understanding in Bechlal what's happening in this whole ritual, and also has a tremendous lesson for life. There are two lengthy Sikhs of the Rebbe, at least, maybe there are more, but there are two relevant for our discussion tonight on Chamisha Asar B'Av, one in Chelek Chav Daled and the other one in Chelek Yutes. I'm going to do my best to bring the two together and to summarize their central points. If you go back to the Mishnah, we saw in the Mishnah where it says, if you turn back to number 5, so it said that the Mishnah says that the women go out and they say, Bachor sanoi necho re'ei mata berlach. Lift up your eyes and see who you are choosing. Don't look at beauty, look at mishpacha, and it brings a pasuk shachar achein v'hevel yefi. Then we looked at the Braisa, and we saw in the Braisa that in fact there are 3 different voices. One said look at beauty, one said look at mishpacha, one said look l'shem shamayim. This is not a contradiction. The Mishnah is true for all women. All women said what you had in the Mishnah. And the Braisa is an elaboration of a later stage that could happen in the conversation. But what you have in the Mishnah was said by everyone. Noi, beauty, means advantages. Any advantage a person has. You're intelligent, you're beautiful, you're smart, you're a good dancer. Any of the advantages you want to talk about under the broader category fall under the category of noi, beauty. And what the woman would say to the man is, Sa'ana inecha, lift up your eyes. What does it mean, lift up your eyes? In other words, a human being has 2 postures. We have 2 postures. One is where our eyes are kind of at regular level. And we all know what that feels like. We all know what life is when we're in that regular zone. Then there's Su'umar Menechem. Lift up your eyes. Uru'umi bara. That's when the human being is successfully lifts himself up. It is in Yiddish, Mishteta Tefach Hecher. And all of a sudden we know that we're in that zone. Some of the regular challenges aren't so challenges. We have 2 different operating systems that we're able to live out of. The woman says, lift yourself up a little. Lift yourself up. Get out of the regular way of interacting with life, or how you look at other people, other human beings, or how you think about marriage and the relationship of men and women. Gain the higher perspective, because you have it in you. You have the ability to lift yourself up and to have that better perspective. To find as Abraham Lincoln said, the better angels of your character. Don't look at the beauty. Don't look at my advantages in the sense of how they're beneficial for you. That's very you-centered. How does my spouse fit into my life? It's good for me. What's good for me? No. Don't look and don't look at how these things are beneficial for you, or why you like them, or what they are. Su'umar menechem is look deeper, look better, look where this person is coming from, look where her talents are coming from. The fact that Hashem is not only the one who gives her what she has, but the real reason to marry her is because that's what Hashem wants. And that's Hashem's plan for you. And therefore, al titein einecha b'noi. What about ten einecha b'mishpacha? Look at mishpacha. Yeah, look at mishpacha. Look at her. What's mishpacha? Mishpacha in a broader sense is her teachers, the education that she got, which informs her character. On a deeper level, mishpacha is that she's a ben Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, she's a Jew. She's here with a mission, with a Jewish mission. She has certain values that she's living by. She lives by the values of her mishpacha, of Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. She wants to implement those in her life. That's what you should be dating for. Dating for that higher type of perspective. It's not the default. It's not the default. But on the other hand, not like Rabbi Yeshua ibn Shuib, who's like, you're dealing with people so holy, lo yispaishashu, it's mamish, hasavi adam and chava lifnei achet. Okay, that I don't have that in me. You don't have that in you. But what you do have in you is su'umar menechem, that you do have. The idea, the higher perspective, the perspective that's a little more about not why is this good for me, but how this is part of my avodas Hashem and how this is what Hashem wants of me, and looking at her not only at the externals, but also her values, which were given to her by her mishpacha and her mission. That's the right perspective. That's what the women were telling the men at that time. And the Rebbe therefore says, Al piza miturid gam kein asher benois Yerushalayim yotzes gam b'yom kippurim. If so, it could happen in Yom Kippur, Yom HaKadosh. Ki kol zeh hoya b'dafka uv'akdam asa'an oinecha. Again, this is not Rabbi Yeshua ibn Shuib. Rabbi Yeshua ibn Shuib is talking about angels as far as I'm concerned. The Rebbe here is explaining, we're talking to human beings. We're talking to human beings who could have their eyes in a low state, so to speak, where it's all about selfishness and externality, and that's all it is. That same person could also have su'umar menechem, and once you have that, then yeah, it could happen on Yom Kippur also, and it's totally fine. It could happen also on Yom Kippur. So obviously, this is not only a shaila in dating. It's also a perspective to look in a marriage, within a marriage. This could be a very, very helpful way of thinking about a spouse. Or b'chlal, thinking about life, anything in life. Just thinking about life the way we walk into the conversation, how this is good for me, and in what way, what is the external nature of things. And then there's looking how a given situation is part of my avodas Hashem, what I am needed for in a given situation, and in how that other person is part of something deeper, a larger mission, a larger purpose. And with this, the Rebbe then said a vart from the Alter Rebbe. The vart from the Alter Rebbe is on the pasuk, Shekar achein ve'hevel ha'yofi. Isha yiras Hashem hisis halo. So how do we normally interpret the pasuk? Chein, throw it out. Yofi, throw it out. What should you play up? Yiras Hashem. The Alter Rebbe introduced another interpretation to this pasuk. Shekar achein, on its own, chein, throw it out. Hevel ha'yofi, on its own, throw it out. Isha yiras Hashem, if you have the yiras Hashem, then the chein and the yofi says halo. All of a sudden that becomes meaningful, that becomes relevant. Why? Because chein on its own is not interesting. Maybe at first it seems interesting, but after you're with it for a while, chein is not interesting. Yofi is not interesting. In fact, nothing is interesting. Dancing is not interesting. No item of olam haza in and of itself is interesting. When it is interesting is when it's harnessed, when it's used, when it's attached to something larger, then it becomes interesting. So shekar achein ve'hevel ha'yofi, in and of itself, there's no value in that. But Isha yiras Hashem, then he says halo, the chein and the yofi. Same thing with the pasuk that we have in the Haftarah. Al yishalo chacham b'chachmasai. Al yishalo gibar b'gvurasai. Chachma, what's that? Gvura, what's that? These are meaningless. So what is it? The pasuk says haskel v'yadoy. So the Alter Rebbe types, yeah, and when you have haskel v'yadoy, that there's a relationship with God, then bring back the chachma, bring back the gvura. All of a sudden now that becomes interesting. All of a sudden now that becomes meaningful. That's what's happening in the Braisa. The Braisa, because in the Mishnah you lay down the foundation. Don't look at the external. Don't look at how I fit into your paradigm. Look at the mishpacha. Look how I'm a yid. Look how I have certain values. Look at how this is a match that Hashem wants you to engage in. Oh, once you have that, then we don't have to run away from the woman's characteristics. Then the Braisa comes and say, the beautiful one said, look at my love about the beauty. And the smart one said, look at me because of the wisdom. And the ones that had wonderful families, they spoke about their families. All of those things become valuable, they become interesting, they become fascinating when they're tethered to, when they're tied to the first thing that you had in the Mishnah when we're talking about the deeper perspective. So these are some very interesting insights for us to think about when we reach Chamisha Asar B'Av. So we start our conversation about mixed dancing. So mixed dancing, that's an example of where it's the externality, where we lost sight of what we're trying to do or we're trying to accomplish in Olam Hazeh. And the message of Chamisha Asar B'Av is the exact opposite message that I think has a lot of relevance for the way we live our lives.